an on-camera expert for many networks, including PBS, TLC, Smithsonian, and National Geographic. He consulted on the Peabody Essex Museum's current exhibit on the Salem witch trials and was a member of the Gallows Hill Project team who confirmed the witch trials execution site. Thank you so much for joining us, Ted.
Thanks, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be with you folks. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, and thanks for all you've done. You've been a great speaker at several of the history camps, and when we can do those live and in person, we will look forward to having you back.
Look forward to it. Hopefully that day's coming sooner rather than later, right? We keep our fingers crossed.
Indeed. And so one of the things that I have learned from you, from attending some of your talks and also a special tour you put on, just a number of things that to me were really helped me change my thinking about what was going on at the time. And I want to start with the first of those, and that is, what was the general perception of the existence of witches? And this would be from whether or not you were an uneducated individual or, one of the professions.
So, if you lived in Salem in 1692, or if you lived in Europe or her colonies in the early modern period, witches were absolutely real. They're in the Bible. Popes, kings, ministers, governors, everybody, all educated people believed they are absolutely real, because witches are created. Witches really get their power from the devil. The devil is created by God as a test of mankind. And if you doubt the existence of witches, it's a slippery slope to say as to whether are you doubting the existence of God. So this is as real a menace as I like to point out in my book. Witchcraft in 1600 is as real and to some degrees as invisible and hard to find a menace as terrorists are for us today. Right? Again, I'm not saying that witches really are real. I think we all recognize that the idea of people using the devil's power to physically harm people is something that hopefully we all agree can't really happen, Lee. But it was tangibly real to people in the 17th century. This was not superstition. This was part of their Christian belief.
Well, I want to go back to Europe and kind of the rest of early North America in a minute. But just before we got started, you said something that was just fascinating, and it also goes to this idea that, well, of course they're real, and so what might a person do in their house to counter some of this? And so I knew that this existed, but I didn't know how. I knew you were knowledgeable. I didn't realize what a personal connection you had. Carrie, I think we've got a picture here.
The daisy wheel, the hexafoil, as it's called. Yeah. There were people would particularly protect their homes with counter magic and to ward off evil. And so, for example, what you're seeing here is a daisy wheel or hexafoil that's carved into the door jamb of actually outside my office and in my house here in York, Maine. And it was this. It's a symbol to ward off evil, and it's a simple design made with a compass. And when you first look at it, you think it's made by a bored school kid on a rainy day, and he's probably caught hell from his parents from carving into the woodwork. But no, these are deliberate designs. They're placed at the entrances of houses by doors and windows or rooms where there's particular harm. And these are used to ward off evil, as are many other things too. For example, boughs of greenery. The whole idea of putting wreaths on one's door at Christmas time didn't start off as a festive practice as much as a way to ward off evil. And I also was showing Lee this before. This is also the thing that we found in my office when we had some renovation work done, found buried in the wall. And it's a broad axe, still sharp, razor sharp, over 200 years old, that was buried in the wall to protect against evil, in large part because iron was considered to be magical and could prevent it as well. So I actually have a whole talk and a chapter of a book I'm writing on how people use these kinds of things to ward off against evil. And Lee, the point is, I think, and maybe we're going backwards here, but this didn't end in 1692. In fact, after 1692, and we can talk about this later, there's all the more reason, perhaps, for people to try to protect their houses because they know that they can no longer use legal proceedings to try to stop a witch. But again, people did not stop believing in witches right away. That belief kept on going for quite some time afterwards. So, but we're getting ahead of the game here. But
I want to touch too on Europe. So.
Sure.
What was going on in Europe, and what was kind of the precursor to the famous events in Salem?
Yeah. So again, really, when European colonists come to North America from all over Europe, they bring their traditions, their beliefs, their religion with them, and that includes witchcraft and witchcraft persecutions. And we know that. And first off, witchcraft and witch hunts are, I like to think, kind of unfortunately as old as time itself, and that pretty much every civilization, going back to ancient Greece and Rome, you name it, almost all civilizations have some version of witchcraft, because frankly, one person's religion is someone else's magic, which is someone else's witchcraft. And so we know in Europe, there's a time, though, between roughly about 1400 AD and roughly the American Revolution, a time period of close to 400 years that's known as the Great Age of Witch Hunts. And in that time, we believe that there are about 100,000 people who faced formal charges of witchcraft, and probably a lot more who the neighbor just cursed them, and say, that damn witch down the street. And of that, maybe as many as half died. And what's intriguing to me is, and one reason I got interested in studying Salem, was the fact that Salem has kind of become synonymous worldwide with witchcraft, and frankly, with extremism, rushing to judgment, persecution, all those things. Yet by European standards, what happened in Salem was not that big. For example, in Cologne, Germany in the 1620s, there's a decade-long witch hunt, which ends up with about 2,000 people being dead, executed for witchcraft. And it's so many, and the records were so bad that we can't say exactly, right? Now, lead to, and sort of segueing to Salem, by comparison in Salem, in the course of about a year and a half of witch accusations and trials, we have at least 172 people accused. We have legal proceedings surviving for 156. 19 people were executed. One was pressed to death, the famous Giles Corey, and 5 people died in prison. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it's by far the largest witchcraft outbreak in American history. And I by no means mean to minimize it, because in fact, one of those people who died in prison, Roger Whittaker, remember Roger Whittaker, the singer? Anyhow, Roger Toothaker. Roger Toothaker is like an ancestor of mine, like a 9th grade uncle, and he died in prison while awaiting trial. But so losing 25 people is a horrific loss, a massive failure of justice, and a failure to protect the innocent. But by European standards, this doesn't even qualify as a moderate witchcraft outbreak. So another, I think it's important to give that perspective. And evenly in America, there are at least about 100 people accused of witchcraft before 1692, principally in New England, and some who were executed. So this is not a new thing that we're dealing with in Salem at all. And in some degrees, it's nearing the end of this age, but there's still, probably a few thousand people that lost their lives in Europe, at least after Salem.
Why was it? It sounds like more prevalent in New England than in perhaps other portions of North America. So,
witchcraft, in particular, in the Christian world, seems to be oftentimes associated with religious tensions. The major outbreaks in continental Europe took place in parts of like Germany and France, areas that were contested lands between Catholics and Protestants. We know that particularly too in the New World, in the English colonies, there seems to be a strong correlation. Again, witches were tried by the Anglican Church, but in particular, Puritanism, fairly extreme form of some of the Protestant sects in 16th and 17th century Europe. There seems to be a strong correlation to that, not only in New England, but also too, for example, in Bermuda, was a hotspot of witchcraft accusation and was also a center of Protestantism, and Puritanism in particular. So, but again, it takes place everywhere. There are cases of a few witchcraft accusations in Maryland, in Virginia in the 17th century and into the 18th century. But it does seem to be involved with, I think, maybe sort of extremes and controversy and tension over religion. And in some ways, New England in the 17th century was kind of a hotbed of belief. And particularly, I like to point out that in Salem, even though we think of it as Puritan New England and Puritan Salem, perhaps in 1692, perhaps as much as 10% of the population of the town were Quakers, who were another kind of radical Protestant sect, but ones that the Puritan majority was particularly sort of fearful of and troubled by. But again, that's a whole nother story we could get into.
So why is it that today, Salem, right, is what people know? Now, I think there may be some local commerce boosterism or something or other, but this goes back further than the chambers of commerce and so forth.
Sure, it absolutely does. It has nothing to do with our haunted happenings. Again, I think Salem was always a hotbed, sort of a controversial place for Protestantism, and for going right back to, people forget that there was this guy Roger Williams, who was kicked out of Massachusetts and founded Rhode Island. What they don't realize was he was kicked out of Salem. He was the minister of Salem. And then he was replaced by a fellow who was the personal chaplain to Oliver Cromwell, and was sort of executed in the Restoration as one of the people who voted in favor in Parliament of the execution of the king. So people of really religious extremes in Salem is part of it, but also too, I think, Salem is the first settlement in Massachusetts Bay in 1626, and in 1630, when the Winthrop fleet shows up, John Winthrop and the company, they first arrive in Salem. So it has kind of pride of place as an ancient settlement, and really second city to Boston and the colony, with kind of a long and storied history that starts well before the witch trials, I like to point out. But I also think too, if you look at what's happens and why we have the witch trials in Salem, is in 1692, Massachusetts was in, well, I call my book A Storm of Witchcraft because it takes a perfect storm of lots of different factors coming together to create what is by far the worst witchcraft outbreak in American history. And to some degree, Salem was at the epicenter of those troubles, but the troubles were also colony-wide, and that's why I think those first accusations of witchcraft would end up spreading outward from Salem. And I'm happy to go into some of those.
Well, do please.
Sure. So I think the first thing was, and sort of the best, maybe still in some degrees the best book on the witch trials in Salem is Boyer and Nissenbaum's Salem Possessed, published in 1974. And it really looks, though, only at Salem Village. And Salem Village, okay, and actually, Carrie, if we could have the first slide of Salem in the 1640s, maybe. A little bit of Salem's history. What we don't realize is when we think of Salem today, was very different when it was first settled. And in fact, you can see here a Salem that occupied much of the North Shore of Massachusetts, ranging from Gloucester on the north to Andover to the west to Lynn on the south. Today, that's all or part of 9 different cities and towns on the North Shore. So into this one settlement, you bring in hundreds of settlers, scatter them throughout the land, and you build one Puritan church and have one Puritan minister to lead the congregation. Well, now you have people, if you look at the western part of town there by Andover, near that area, that's the area that we know of as Danvers today in Middleton. At the time in the 1630s and 40s and 50s, it became Salem Village. And you had people in places like Salem Village or up the coast in what is now Beverly or Manchester or to the south in Marblehead that didn't like the idea of spending all day walking back and forth to Salem Neck there, down you see sort of in the middle of this peninsula, where the meeting house was. They wanted to form their own towns, hire their own ministers. And so Salem Village, and maybe, Carrie, if you can go to the next image of Salem and Village in Salem in 1692. By 1692, many of these areas had split off. But Salem Village, that area that we now know as Danvers and part of Peabody, had still remained part of Salem. And you can see kind of in the middle of Salem there in the slide, you'll see Salem Village and the meeting house pictured there. Finally, in the 1670s, they say to people in Salem Village, we're not going to let you leave. We want you to be part of our town. We need you for your taxes and militia duty and night watch and things like that. But we'll let you, tell you what, you can build the meeting house with your own money if you want and hire your own minister. So Salem Village has this kind of what we might consider today to be a parish status. And it doesn't go well, long story short. And that's what Boyer and Nissenbaum really talk about, how by 1692, when the outbreak starts in Salem, the first accusations, Salem village is on its fourth minister. There's huge factionalism in the village, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. And it is this factionalism that bursts out in the first accusations of witchcraft that take place in the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister. But and we can come back and talk about that. But the other thing is, too, is the reason this will spread is because it isn't just the problems in Salem Village and the arguments over who's going to be minister and who we pay our taxes to. There's colony-wide distress in Massachusetts in 1692. You know, Lee, it's really interesting. Wolfgang Behringer, great European witchcraft historian, has pointed out that witchcraft accusations happen when two things take place. One is historically bad weather, especially in an agrarian society. If you have bad weather, that means crop failure, that means starvation, that means economic misery, inflation, it means starvation and death, right? And then what happens if those things happen? You turn to the government to try to help you. So if you have a weak central government that people don't trust and are worried about doing the right thing to, say, stop the spread of an epidemic or to end a war or to provide food for people who can't buy food, that's when you have witch hunts and people looking to take problems into their own hands. So Salem in 1692 in Massachusetts was in the middle of the Little Ice Age, the absolute worst weather in recorded history. Now, as if that isn't bad enough, witchcraft is also always about religion. And at the time, Massachusetts Puritans think that their religion is on the decline. They've created this special Puritan colony, and it's endangered from internal and external threats. Maybe the king is going to take our charter away like he just did. So there's a fear over the fact that not as many people are attending worship as they did in the past, and that God is going to punish us. And add on to that, a military disaster taking place where Massachusetts is losing this war on its northern frontier of Maine and New Hampshire to the Native Americans and their French allies. And so you have the whole colony in disarray. And in the spring of 1692, about this time, they hear that a new governor, William Phipps, is coming, and he's coming with a new charter, a whole new form of government. And people are going to wait till the middle of May for him to show up, and they're anxious, they're angry, they're scared, they're looking to their government to help them, and they don't even know what the government's going to look like. And those are the kind of factors you have that lead to accusations of witchcraft, looking for someone to blame for their trouble.
So,
I know that's a lot. I'm sorry.
Yeah, talk to us about that first incident.
I'm sorry?
That's right. Talk to us about the first incident.
Sure. Yeah. So the first they've called afflictions, right? Again, this is treated like a medical condition at first. Reverend Parris, the minister in Salem Village, the sort of embattled minister, the majority of people on the committee that hire and fire the minister want to fire him. They start off by refusing to pay his salary, refusing to bring firewood into the house. Parris sees this almost as a demonic attack. He thinks that his opponents must be in league with Satan and they're out to get him. And he's storming around the parsonage, practicing these fire and brimstone sermons, very martial. And by the way, those sermons survive and they're published and you can read them. Well, maybe under the circumstances, it's not surprising that the first people to be afflicted in Salem Village are his daughter and his niece, Abigail, who lives with him. These are little girls around ages 12 and 10 years old. And all of a sudden, they start acting very strangely. They act afflicted. Parris brings in a doctor to examine them and trying to figure out why they're screaming and barking like a dog and trying to throw themselves into the fire and why they feel like someone's sticking pins and needles into them, but there's no signs of any damage to them. And after a while, he determines that they actually must be afflicted with witchcraft. And that because, again, by the scientific standards of the day, there's no other logical explanation. And this appears to be the scholarly, medical opinion that these children are, in fact, bewitched. And that's how it starts, and it will rapidly grow.
Now, just just to clarify, problem. I'm not quite sure how to fix it. Talk to us, if you would. Were those young girls accused of witchcraft, or were they victims?
Good question. So these are considered the first victims of the witch trials. Ironically, sometimes in the case of Salem, it happened to one or two people who were first afflicted by witchcraft, and who were then end up being accused. But normally, you're showing signs of a witch harming you in one way or another. Now, realize, Lee, witches can harm people in many ways. They could have a horrible storm that would cause lightning to strike a house and have the house to burn down. It could destroy hail and thunder and lightning that would destroy crops. They could make a cow become sick and die. Or they could also physically harm people and perhaps even kill them. And in this case, the minister's daughter and niece seem to show signs of being afflicted by a witch, at which point the next case is going to try to figure out, the parishes have to figure out who in fact is the witch who is afflicting these poor young girls, right? Because clearly there must be someone at work in our village who is in league with Satan and is trying to harm us and our family.
So, Carrie, I think you're going to ask the next question.
All right. Sorry, Leah's going to try to restart because his sound is going all wonky. So,
okay.
All right. So take us through this a little bit more. What happens next? How does it escalate?
So, it starts off with these two little girls in the minister's house. And within a week or two, you have a couple of more young adolescent girls, maybe 10, 12, 14, on different sides of town. And then it just grows. And literally, that's why sometimes we refer to it almost like a disease. We talk about the spread of witchcraft, right? And an outbreak like a disease, because it just goes throughout Salem Village, again, working along, in some cases, along these sort of lines of dissent and factionalism and fear. And before you know it, you have several dozen people in Salem Village accusing that they are afflicted. They are accusing their neighbors. They're accusing family members in some cases. So by the time the governor arrives in Massachusetts, the new governor arrives in May, you have the prisons filled. There have been over 50 people accused. You've got more accusations coming in daily. And literally by June, you have over 100 people accused of witchcraft. And the formal legal proceedings will begin in the spring. But again, they have to wait. They start bringing in people accused of witchcraft and questioning them. But they have to wait for the arrival of the new governor to begin legal proceedings. And the first trials for witchcraft will formally begin in early June. And over the course of June, the court created specially for this, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, headed by nine counselors. Today we call them state senators, who also have legal powers as judges, are appointed to run a special court of Oyer and Terminer. They will, in the end, hold 4 sessions, and during those sessions will end up, convicting 19 people of witchcraft, executing 19 people of witchcraft, pressing to death another, and will also convict others and hold many others on charges. In the end, we'll have over 150 people in jail. And this sort of terror gradually plays out throughout the summer and into the early fall. And finally, in the fall of 1692, in October, Governor William Phipps brings that round of the trials to an end. Essentially, he comes home from building forts on the Maine frontier to defend it, and he realizes that his wife, and also apparently the wife of Increase Mather, the leading minister of the colony, have been accused of witchcraft. And at which point, Governor Phipps says, something's wrong here, because these are people who are not witches, and he brings the trials to an end. But here's the problem, Carrie. They still have over 100 people still in court, and they end up creating a new court, one that works under different rules of evidence that are much more reduced, and we can talk about that if you want. But it takes them until the following May 1693 before the last people have their trials, are found not guilty. A couple of cases are pardoned, and are allowed to go home. So it sort of all plays out over really sort of the really intense part of the panic is over the spring and summer of 1692, and then gradually, finally, in the fall, it sort of breaks, but that sort of terror continues.
Okay, and if I understand right, now my sound is being weird. If I understand right, there in a lot of the cases, these were lower class, lower economic status, people who were accused. But in Salem, it did develop further to where it reached all sorts of, all levels of society.
Yes,
and that
exactly.
was kind of when Governor Phipps was ready to put an end to it.
Right. When witchcraft is usually a working class crime, right? And it's also a neighborly crime. So it's often, neighborly disputes over property, over, hey, your hogs got loose and ruined my field, is what Rebecca Nurse, actually, who died, was one of the people executed. A complaint that she got into with her neighbors was over their hogs. It starts with these kind of neighborly disputes. Usually witchcraft accusations take place on what we'd call the wrong side of the tracks, because it involves, mostly women cursing their neighbors. And again, usually it's like a working class crime. But in Salem, what makes it sort of different is it spreads outward throughout the community, throughout the region, and also upward, up the social ladder. So before you know it, you have people like ministers, members of the legislature. No jokes here about the Massachusetts legislature, please. But we actually had members of the Massachusetts legislature accused of witchcraft in 1692, and other leaders of the colony, right? And in some degrees, I think that reflects, to me, that anger that people had over the government's failure to act to protect them. And that is kind of one of the things that's unique about Salem. And I think the other thing I should mention that's unique about Salem is spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is responsible for pretty much all of the accusations in Salem. And what a spectral evidence is, when you say that it is a someone's ghost or spirit or specter who is harming you, and that they may be pinching you, hurting you, choking you. The trick here is that they're invisible to anybody except the assailant. So I would go like, oh, God, no, Carrie, no, stop, make it stop. Carrie's harming me. She's hurt. Stop it, Lee, make it stop. And you go like, wait a second, Ted, you're in the room by yourself. What's this going on? So this idea of spectral evidence seems kind of crazy to us, all right? Well, it did to people in the 17th century too, but not for the reasons we're thinking. Because again, remember, witchcraft is real. Specters are real. And the real trick here is, whose specter is it? Now, some people believed that, Carrie, must be a witch because Tad is seeing her specter harm him, hurt him, choke him. Her soul must be corrupt. She must be in league with Satan for her specter to be used to harm Tad. That's what the witchcraft judges believed. But a lot of people in the colony said, I'm not so sure, because Satan is pretty powerful, and Satan's also the great trickster. And you know what? It could well be that Carrie is the good, God-fearing Christian woman we know her to be, and the real evil person here is Lee, who's in league with Satan, and he's using his powers to make it look like it's Carrie's specter when it's really his. And it's a perfect twofer, because Lee's got what he's always wanted. He's choking Tad, and he's blaming Carrie for it, so she's going to get executed for witchcraft too. What could be better? So you see, it's kind of complicated. But the point is, in Salem, the only time the accusations really ended and the trials really ended in stopping convicting people was when Governor Phipps said, that's it, no more trials. And when we start them up again, we're not going to use spectral evidence. We're going to go to the good old-fashioned rules for witchcraft, which is there's only two ways to convict someone for witchcraft, right? One is confession. Signed confession. I'm a witch. Okay, well, we can talk about why someone would do that, but usually it comes down to they're being tortured. Because why would you say you're a witch when you probably know you're going to be immediately sentenced and executed to death, right? Or sentenced to death and executed. Or you have two eyewitnesses that say that they saw you carry out an act of black magic. Now, again, Lee, if you and I pretty much agree that, black magic and getting power from Satan to kill people is something that can't really happen. So then or now, it would be hard to get two people to testify on oath that they saw that happen, right? So once you eliminate that idea of using spectral evidence to accuse people, it's really hard to convict anyone of witchcraft, and that really kind of brings the trials to an end. And that is the hallmark of Salem that's so important, is because usually spectral evidence is not considered, or not considered very strongly. But for a few months in Massachusetts, it was with really tragic consequences.
So the total time period. Sorry, we still got audio problem. We can't quite figure it out. The total time period from first accusation to the last.
So the first accusations took place like in late February, early March, 1692. There actually were accusations even made into October. Even one was made a day or two after the governor had said the witchcraft trials are ending. And then again, it took from that point forward, though, they'd stopped the trials. They started them up again in January, and it took until May 1693 before the last people were cleared from the courts and were allowed to go home. And even in this case, ultimate insult, in 1692 in Massachusetts, you were held in these dank jails. Think dungeon today, right? Semi-subterranean pits where you're chained in position all day. If you're lucky, you barely get to see the light of day. You're in your own excrement and vomit, and the rats are running around, and it's a god-awful place. And 5 people died in prison. And so in many cases, people are there for months. And to make it even worse, even if you're found not guilty before you're released from prison, you have to pay your jailkeeper essentially for your room and board. So this was the ultimate sort of for-profit business, right? Was jails. And in fact, the last woman who died had been found not guilty by the courts, but she was sitting in jail awaiting for her family to find the money. They were a poor family, and they were trying to find the money to pay her jailer's fee so she could be freed and go home. And she caught jail fever or some other illness and died before she could come home.
It is just hard to fathom.
It is, but Lee, if you think about that unknown fear, I think all societies have their witch trials and their witch hunts, because when I teach the witch trials, I teach it almost as much as a social justice course as anything else, right? It really is about difference, about scapegoating, of looking for someone to blame for your problems. And then as now, it's a lot easier to look outward and try to blame someone else than to reflect and say, maybe this one's on me, right? And so to me, that's kind of, one of the sorts of lessons, and that it, in fact, I read news stories today and I just sort of shake my head and I kind of like, wow, here we go again. Yeah, indeed.
I think we have some questions. I'm sure we have questions. Carrie, do you want to rejoin us? And we'll cross our fingers on the audio here. Not quite sure.
Am I coming through okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and I put headphones in. We'll see if that will help on my end.
All right.
Kathy would like to know about the theory that there was fungus on the red wheat that they used to bake with. Did that contribute to weird behavior or anything like that?
It contributed to a bunch of weird TV documentaries, I think, is the biggest problem. No, seriously. This is the ergot poisoning theory, and it is like the single most popular theory put forward by the Salem witch trials. And by the way, my good friend Margot Burns, I know, has given a history camp talk on ergot. So my short answer is check out what Margot says about this. But in large part, what we're talking about is this idea that ergot was a mold, a natural mold that formed on rye, which was the principal crop used in Massachusetts at the time to make wheat from and for their bread. And if that rye is stored and gets moldy and damp and the fungus starts spreading on it, it is a natural form of LSD. And so the idea that was come out with about around the late 60s, the hippy dippy Timothy Leary LSD 60s, was that people were just having like a bad trip from this. Now, couple things that are wrong with this. And again, it sounds good on theory, but reason I call my book A Storm of Witchcraft for another reason is because I don't think there's any single affliction that explains this. I mean, again, you had dozens of people across Essex County, as far south as like Boston and west, who were showing symptoms of this. There's no single way to describe and what's going on. But so is it possible one or two people had this? Maybe. But think about this. What the idea that what came forward was that people, there must have been one grain supply in Salem Village that all these people were eating from, and it was bad, and they were having bad trips. Well, nope. We know these were people across Salem. We know there were afflicted people in Andover. And why would it be that only one or at most two or three members of a family suffered the signs of affliction, right? So it doesn't really work from a disease pattern for everybody. And again, yeah, maybe one or two. The other thing too is it doesn't make sense is from the medical condition, because there are a bunch of different types of ergot poisoning, at least two or three. I think two that I know of. And if you do have ergot poisoning and you continue to get worse, and by the way, that didn't happen in Salem. The girls would be just fine one day and then afflicted the next, and fine and then afflicted. With ergot, it's like any poison, you get worse and worse and worse, and it gets so bad that essentially your arms begin to blacken, wither, necrotize, limbs fall off, and you die. No one mentions anything like this in 1692, and I kind of hunch they would, right? But again, it's made for lots of unfortunate, questionable documentaries that are looking for simple answers to, as we usually know in history, there usually isn't a real simple answer, right? So, but again, it sounds good in theory, and I always get asked it.
Right.
Okay. Let me say one other thing too. The other one I always get asked is, okay, Dad, it wasn't that. But we know they were doing it. They were accusing their neighbors to get their land. No, that doesn't work either. For reasons that, yes, if you accuse someone of witchcraft, the state gets to take their movable goods, like their cows, their clothes, their books, but their land, their property passes on to their heirs. And by the way, the neighbors, even if there was some sort of benefit, as usual, it was the state that benefited, not the individual. So it wasn't that either. Again, it's complicated.
Right. Okay. We have another question. This person would like to know, were Ann Putnam and Judge Sewell the only people to publicly repent? How long afterwards did that happen? And what did they say, particularly Ann? Yeah.
So it's really interesting because I kind of look at both of their statements as they're kind of mirrors. You can read into them what you want and see what you want. Some people say, see, they admitted they were guilty and that they were lying and they made this all up and stuff. No, they didn't. What both of them said, and Samuel Sewell is the first to do it. In 1696, he helps author a law in Massachusetts where he's in the legislature, calls for a day of fasting and humiliation, which is celebrated in January of 1697. And basically, it's a day where Puritans would fast and have Thanksgiving and pray to God to pardon them for their sins and for the colony's sins. And amongst those sins, they say, was the sin of witchcraft, right? Sewell, on that day, humbles himself before his parish in Boston and has his minister read his apology. And again, it's an amazing act of contrition of one of the most powerful men in the colony to step forward and to show his apology, his sincere and deep and feelings that we'd hold for the rest of his life to try to make amends for being one of the judges in the witch trials. But if you read the statement, what he really says is, and to some degrees, kind of what Ann Putnam will say a few years later when she's applying to join the first church in Salem Village, is that the sin was that we believed Satan. The sin was we allowed Satan to trick us, and for that, good lives and innocent people were harmed and good lives were lost. But again, the sin is in falling for Satan's wiles, not that anything untoward was done here. We did as any good Englishman, any good Puritan would do, and did this to protect our society, to protect our families. And it really is kind of the way those apologies will go. But having said that, there is one other apology that takes place about the same time that is, again, very sort of short, and I would say, doesn't really say one way or another what people really thought was going on. But it's a list of 12 of the jurors. We know there are at least about 60 or more jurors who were involved in the witch trials, various different panels, because these were not kangaroo courts. This was English justice with grand juries, and also with trial juries of 12 good and honest men. And sorry, of course, back then women did not have the right to vote, would not have served. You had to be a man kind of some substance, actually, to make the cut. And there were actually 12 jurors who about the same time signed a letter expressing their apology for being involved in the conviction of innocent lives as well, too. Ironically, aside from, none of the other judges, none of the other people in Salem, not Reverend Paris, people like that, they never apologized.
Okay. All right. We have a viewer who would like to know, other than Salem, was spectral evidence generally allowed in witchcraft trials?
Yeah, it shows up in limited places. And the way it's used in Salem is very different too, because it's used just about everybody, to my knowledge, that is accused in Salem. The first accusation against them, the leading accusation, is that their specter afflicted these people, mostly young, mostly teenage girls, but also some adult women and also several men. But it is spectral evidence that sort of first points someone out for further consideration as a witch. Okay, and then it's the other evidence that will sort of pile onto it. In other cases, occasionally you will see spectral evidence used, but it's usually sort of secondhand to the other more serious charges, more traditional charges of witchcraft against people. So it's used only in limited doses and in very much kind of a supporting role elsewhere. But in Salem, it rules supreme, and again with tragic consequences. And it's interesting the way non-spectral evidence is really used in other places too, where again you want to try to get the confession. And the interesting thing here is, as recently as 4 years before Salem, you had one of the first witchcraft executions in Massachusetts in decades, when Goody Glover is executed in Boston after confessing to being a witch. And even there, people questioned, why would she confess? Because she knows the penalty. So even after she was convicted, or she confessed, before she was convicted and passed sentence, they had a group of doctors, ministers, meet with her to interview her to make sure she was of sound mind, because she's an old woman, and if she's crazy, she's not a witch, right? And why would we harm her? Unfortunately, Goody Glover apparently did confess to being a witch, and was summarily, tried, convicted, executed, sentenced to death, and executed. Now, Carrie, I suppose your question is going to be like, why would she confess? And again, in this case, I don't think she probably wasn't tortured. In her case, probably. I think, as I like to sort of say, I think her real crime here, by Puritan standards, was she was an Irish woman, and that is the Irish. We could talk about all sorts of things about the Puritans and race, and also other, even like the Irish. But my point is, she probably only spoke Gaelic, did not speak much English. When she was questioned by the ministers, she may have had a really bad translator at work. And also, too, though, the kind of questions they might have asked a woman who was raised a Catholic. Do you worship anybody or venerate anyone other than God? Well, of course, I venerate the saints. Saints, tell us about saints. Well, and again, once you start talking about saints, go, oh, that sounds an awful lot like you're admitting that you're in league with demons who are helping you out with things, right? So in the end, I think that may have caused, unfortunately, with the Glover case, we don't know very much. So there were other, there's all kinds of evidence like that. There's also physical evidence, right? Evidence of puppets, or what we'd call a voodoo doll, which people think is being Tituba and Caribbean, and it's not. Tituba was probably actually a North American, Native American. And if she learned any sort of voodoo, it was probably good English practice, what we call image magic. And in image magic, what you would do is make a doll in the image of somebody, maybe get a lock of their hair, a piece of their clothes, right? What we would call a voodoo doll, and then like stick it with a pin, and you make that person pain, right? Or you stick the feet over the fire and their feet start burning. This is perfectly good English magic. It's called image magic. And we know in the Salem witch trials, several people actually brought what they called poppets, little puppets. I always think of the TV show. God, is it Mrs. Robin Williams is Mrs. Doubtfire, right? I know puppets. Well, puppets actually were like puppets that were voodoo dolls. And we actually know of some of them that showed up in Salem, including one woman, the daughter of the Salem minister, who was accused of witchcraft. And they say, so talk to us about this. We hear that you say that a witch is out to get you. He said, yeah, that's right. And you know what I did? I made these puppets here, and you made them in her image, and I'm getting her back before she gets me. Now, here's the thing. To us, that kind of makes sense. It's counter magic, right? But here's the thing. By Puritan standards, any kind of magic is evil. Whether it's a daisy wheel, whether it's a wreath on your door, whether it's a doll or anything like that, because God does not perform magic. We pray to God, please, God, relieve me from these evils, from these ills, from these demons. And hopefully God will answer your prayer. But if you're doing some sort of magic, even if it's to stop the devil, you are also asking Satan for help, right? Anyhow, I've said way too much about magic and counter magic and evidence, but hopefully I answered the question there about spectral evidence. It's not that common, except in places like Salem.
Right. Okay, great.
No, I'm sorry, Katie. One other quick thing. I'm sorry.
Yes.
The other thing too is realize, here's the problem. Some of the people accused in witchcraft, including the first accused, people have thought they've been witches for decades. The first woman tried, Bridget Bishop, had been first accused of witchcraft and charged with witchcraft like a dozen years earlier. And so witchcraft beliefs are always there. Again, just like we always know that terrorists are real and there's a threat and we don't necessarily think it's real. But what happens when things start going really badly in 1692 and people start getting accused of witchcraft? They're going, well, I've had my doubts about Bridget Bishop for years, and Bridget Bishop wasn't the first accused, but she was the first tried because they had the strongest case against her, which included all kinds of non-spectral evidence, like someone saying, I found a puppet in the basement of her house a few years ago, right? So that's really important. And just like today, if I'm sitting here at home, am I looking out the window for terrorists? No. If I hear a fire alarm in an ambulance, do I think of terrorists? Not really. If I hear a large explosion and see clouds on the horizon, I go like, uh-oh. And at some point, where do you begin to go to that really dark spot saying like, things aren't normal. Maybe in 1692, maybe there's a witch at work. Or today we say, oh my God, I hope, I don't live that far from the naval yard. I hope everything's okay there, right? Those kinds of things. So yeah,
Right.
See, the mind is a wonderful but terrifying thing.
Right. All right. We have one last question for you. Your book discusses that the Puritan government tries to suppress the trials. What happened and how did that become a turning point from Puritan communalism to Yankee independence?
Wow. Is that my editor, Tim Bent, who sent that question in? Thank you for that fastball. So in fact, actually, my book is published in a series of books on pivotal moments in American history. And I really do think that it was a turning point in many ways because these are the last people executed in America for witchcraft. And part of the problem, I think, is that people begin to realize that maybe it isn't really good that the governor's top advisors are Puritan ministers. And maybe we need a little bit of distancing of church and state. And maybe the Puritan church isn't as great and perfect as we thought it was, and people begin to have their doubts more and more about the place of religion, and maybe we begin to see gradually the beginnings of the division of church and state. And again, I don't think, it's not like someone flipped a switch and said, okay, we aren't Puritans anymore, but it's the beginning of people beginning to sort of distance themselves, and I think in some ways it's the beginning of the end of Puritanism. It certainly, to me, is the first case of massive failure by a government in America to not protect the innocent. You have massive failure of the government to protect innocent lives with it. And basically, by the fall of 1692, Governor Phipps has essentially issued a publications ban. So he's trying to cover up the fact that all this stuff happened. He doesn't want people writing books saying like, the government should never have let this happen. Innocent lives were lost. My mother was a Puritan saint. Rebecca Merce was a godly grandmother. How dare you execute this innocent, godly woman for witchcraft on these trumped up charges? He didn't want that story getting out there. And in fact, the publication ban instituted by the colony lasted almost 4 years. And invariably what happens is efforts to suppress the truth, whether it's in 1692 or with Richard Nixon and Watergate, do a couple of things. One is they lead to massive mistrust of the government. And again, I think Americans mistrust, deep in our inner selves, it's like we laugh when we hear, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, right? Because we have our doubts. So I think to some degree, Salem is the beginning of that story. And it's also increasingly this time when gradually New Englanders are beginning to fall away from the Puritan church, to fall away from that religious world, become more involved in that secular world, that world of commerce and trade, of reaching out to people across the Atlantic world and beginning to bring in and allowing religious freedom to different faiths. In fact, by 1692, the King of England has insisted upon it. Realize between 1659 and 1661, Massachusetts executes 4 Quakers who come into the colony simply trying to proselytize, to convert people to Quakerism. But by 1692, people are allowed to have more opportunity to join different churches. And I think people, again, increasingly sort of say, wow, something went tragically wrong in Salem, and what do we do to make sure that doesn't happen again? What changes might we want to make to our government and our lives, how we run our legal proceedings, how we trust the government and who we allow in the government. Matter of fact, the elections right after the Salem witch trials in the Massachusetts legislature had massive turnover and people voted in. And that almost never happened. It's kind of like today where if you're the incumbent, yep, okay. But people realized something was wrong and it was time to vote the bums out and bring in a new bunch of bums. So, I think to me, that's the story about Salem, is that you really do see these incredible changes kind of start to percolate. And again, they take a long time. And I guess, in the last chapter of the book, I sort of talk about this process where you look at it out about 75, 100 years. And if you look at people in Massachusetts during the American Revolution, a lot of them are like the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who were involved in the Salem witch trials, Look at Nathan Hale, the man who regretted that he had but one life to give for his country, right? Well, his great-grandparents were Reverend Hale and his wife of Beverly. Reverend Hale was one of the people who thought the witchcraft accusations were just fine until in late fall when, of course, his wife was accused of witchcraft, right? Or take General Israel Putnam of Salem Village, whose grandparents and whose parents and grandparents were involved in the proceedings in Salem Village, who, of course, is one of the most successful generals of the American Revolution, old Putt, right, who was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so if you think about this, people never let America forget the witch trials. Those people at Bunker Hill knew about the Salem witch trials, right? And also, too, each generation forward kept on trying to keep the memory alive. We know the last court proceeding in Salem regarding the trials, as late as the 1740s, there were families of the victims still petitioning the government to have convictions reversed. They wanted innocency restored for their family. They wanted reparations. They wanted damages. And again, this lasted for 50 years beyond the trials. And people, again, never, ever forgot what happened. And no one has ever let them forget that since then. And to me, that's part of that whole story of that transition from kind of Puritan to Yankee to present day Salem, where we still honor the memory of the victims of 1692.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. This has been absolutely fantastic. We've all learned a lot tonight and enjoyed this. So we will put a post to Margot Burns' talk from History Camp in our Facebook chat tomorrow. And we also have a link tonight for Tad's book. So check that out. It's great. Lots of good stuff in there that we didn't have a chance to get to tonight. And we also have a tour from last year's America Summer Road Trip of the Rebecca Nurse Homestead, and we will put that in the chat for you as well. Check that out. That's an interesting story also.
Great place. Highly recommended.
Wonderful. So if you're in the area and you can check it out, that would be great also. All right. Next week, March 18th, we will be speaking with Clay Risen about Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and the Spanish-American War. So we hope to see you then. Thank you so much. Have a good night.